I'm David Spencer. Welcome to Gardening with Bugs. My YouTube channel is about gardening with bugs, but what if you don't want to garden with bugs? What if you really want to get rid of an unsightly pest or something that's damaging your plant, or you think it's going to kill it? You might be tempted to grab an off-the-shelf pesticide or make some sort of home concoction yourself, and that's what I want to talk about today. Some of those have consequences for your plant that you may not see right away, but can actually lead to, believe it or not, more pest problems. So that's what we'll talk about in today's video. Stay tuned. For me, this is what it's all about: picking fresh fruit and vegetables directly from the garden. And of course, I want my kids to have the same experience. This is basically what it's for, to teach them how to grow and how to respect plants. So when they're coming by and picking strawberries, I don't want them to have a chemical residue, and I really want to stay away from some of the pesticides that can get off the shelf in order to combat a variety of pests. So of course I'm going to lean towards organic, but sometimes organic just means that it's not a synthetic chemical, and people are quick to create pesticides because they're deemed organic, or use organic pesticides that are still broad spectrum in targeting all sorts of pests and still have cause damage to your plant that you need to be aware of. But one of the very first hurdles I think we all need to recognize is that organic doesn't necessarily mean safe, because plant-derived chemicals have been used and have serious health consequences forever. We've used nicotine, a derivative from tobacco, as a pesticide, and things like pyrethrum come from the chrysanthemum family. So they're pesticides that have been identified as a plant's own response, and they've been taken out, used as a pesticide, and eventually maybe they've been created synthetically, but it's essentially the same chemical. So of course we want to avoid those chemicals. But what people are quick to do sometimes is spray soaps and detergents on their plant. So online you can find any recipe that might call for like blending onions or cayenne pepper, and of course add dish soap or some sort of oil or some sort of detergent. And really what you're doing is creating a successful pesticide. It's really very noxious, and of course they kill pests. Some of them are very effective. They might not be used commercially. That's just because the cost of grinding these things up could never compare to some synthetically produced chemical.
Got a raspberry.
Okay, let's talk about some of the options out there. So of course you can go to a hardware store and get an off-the-shelf chemical pesticide. And some of them we'll talk about being kind of specific to a pest, but generally they are very effective pesticides and kill indiscriminately. So we'll touch on that a little bit later. Now you can also get home concoctions, like I mentioned, just blending a bunch of stuff together in soaps, and those are also usually very effective as well. And again, they don't target any specific pests. They're really just going to wipe out anything living on that plant. And then you'll find things like other organic but commercially produced chemicals, and usually they're either out like a plant-derived a pesticide. They're a little bit safer to use, but again, they're just indiscriminately killing pests. So that's the first problem with using any of these. And maybe that's not a problem to you because you'll want to wipe them clean, but let me warn you about that procedure. The way I like to think about it is your plant is totally clean. As it grows, it'll develop all sorts of infestations, but most of those don't have any consequence to you whatsoever. So there's thousands of spores that are all over, like my cucumbers right here. They have all the powdery mildew spores on them right now, and their natural ability to fight it off is a combination of rain washing those leaves off and just the right growing conditions for them never to infect it. Likewise with pests, sure, you might see the odd spider mite that shows up on here. They can get aphids, but if you just let nature take its course, you'll get populated with more pests and more predators. And typically, if the growing conditions are correct and the plant is healthy, its own ability to fight off those pests, including the infections like mold and mildew, is already there. So when you apply something like a homemade pesticide that has a soap or a detergent or an oil, what you typically are doing is wiping that plant clean again. Now, as soon as you wipe the plant clean, it's like starting from scratch. The plant is food, so what's going to come first is anything that eats it. Now, it's important for you to understand that step, because there's a lot of advancement in treating things like mildews not by getting rid of the spores, but by instead applying a different sort of mildew or fungus or bacteria to the plant, which basically occupies the space so that the other ones can't compete. So instead of the idea of wiping it clean, the idea is to bombard it with as much living things as possible so that no one thing can take over your plant. So when you're using something like any of these, if you wipe that plant clean, you're going to start from scratch. So the first thing you're going to get is the pests. Now, the effectiveness of a pesticide usually has a lot to do with how long it takes for those pests to come back. So the very noxious chemicals can sometimes have a lasting effect. So you think maybe for the whole growing season, your plants are healthy, it worked, and the pest never came back. So that's great for you. It's like I said before, I don't want to go that route because it's very toxic. But there's another thing that usually happens, especially with home remedies, and that's all the perfumes and scents, some of the other ingredients that go into either commercial pesticides or home concoctions as well. And some of those smells, you wipe the plant clean of the pests, some of those smells can then ward off predators. In some cases, the predators just can't find the prey because it's the smell of the prey, like a Phytolides finds aphids on your plants by smelling the honeydew they produce. And if you have applied something like blended onion, for example, that's going to mask that smell. The pests are just desperate, they're going to feed there anyways, but the predators will just go on to another plant. So that's one of the problems right there is you're wiping it clean and you're making the plant less attractive. But perhaps the worst part is that even commercial sprays use a spreader and a sticker. And what that is, the spreader is basically an ingredient that allows the liquid to get into very small droplets so that it can act like a fog and get underneath and cover as much foliage as possible. And the sticker is sort of like typically like soap, and what it will allow to do, or there's soaps and oils sort of mixed together there, and the sticker is meant to adhere to the leaves so that you have that lasting impact. Otherwise, if it just came washed right off the plant, it would have no impact whatsoever. So you want it to stay for a couple hours maybe. Now, those aren't the active ingredients. The active ingredient is the chemical that then kills the pest. But what we found time and time again is the pests become resistant to the active ingredient, but the pesticide, the spray, still works because it's the spreader and the sticker that's also killing them. And that's why people are using things like neem oil and other surfactants. You can actually just smother and kill the pests. But unless you're 100% on every inch of that surface, you're not going to kill them all. And for things like thrips that lay their eggs inside the plant tissue, you'd have to keep reapplying until you've got them all anyways. So the spreader and sticker is basically like an oil and a soap, and that's basically what you're making with a home concoction. So if you're adding dish soap and a bit of cayenne pepper blending an onion, you've basically got like an acid and you've got a soap, and that is killing the pests, and it's very effective. But that's where the problem lies, is the soaps and detergents. And yes, there's a difference between a soap and a detergent, but really for the purpose of this discussion, they're acting the same way. And what they do is they're very good at dissolving, basically washing away like waxes and oils. And that's exactly what the plant is producing to protect itself from pests and UV. There's a little wax coating. It's usually more pronounced on the tops of leaves, and underneath it's usually there's a thinner membrane, and that's why you see things like spider mites really go underneath. It's easier for them to penetrate it. So when you use a soap or a detergent on the plant tissue, you're going to wipe that layer off. So yes, you've killed the bugs, but now what you've done is you've caused the plant some serious plant stress, and you might not notice it, but what's going on inside is a chemical response to try to repair the leaves. Now, in some cases, that chemical response can trigger an attraction of pests. So we know that some pests can smell plants. Why they infect one and not the other could be a different wavelength that they're seeing. It could be the smell of the plant. Sometimes it's like fresh growth that they will recognize. But the plant stress is one that can attract a lot of pests, especially something like spider mite. So as soon as you put the plant in this recovery mode from using a soap and detergent on it, you're going to increase the likelihood that something like a spider mite is going to immediately be able to pierce that thinned leaf tissue and survive, multiply a bit quicker than it would have before. So the tools in your toolbox are, of course, the chemical pesticides, the organic commercial ones, and your home remedies as well. You use them sparingly. Always try water first. Water has a huge impact on pests. You can blast off aphids who will break off their mouthpieces. They just can't reproduce it unless you're constantly feeding, so that alone does a huge damage to their population. Spider mite, if you keep them wet long enough, the inside fungi that lives in their gut will bloom and rupture them apart. There's all sorts of bugs you can control just with water, and of course if it's as big as a caterpillar, just flick it off. Sometimes just that simple removal, even though they can walk all the way back, is enough to expose them to predators or just stop their feeding enough that the plant recovers and you don't really notice the pest damage anyways. So understand that there's all these tools in the toolbox. You don't have to quickly jump to dawn and spray your plants and then wonder why they don't look very good or you have spider mite problems in August. And it's important to use those very targeted. Like, don't blanket a plant. You do not want to kill everything on your plants. There are beneficial insects, like we talked about with mildews. Like, there's beneficial fungi and bacteria all over them. You really want all that there. If you use too much chemical too, it gets into the soil, and there's really very few pests that you should ever try a drench with, especially outside, because that indiscriminately kills the column of soil, and that living soil is like largely responsible for the health of your plants. So really avoid things like silly things like using neem oil in the ground, which I've heard of people doing. It doesn't really make sense. Yes, it'll probably smother and kill some things, but that's just it's an irresponsible technique to use in your garden. And lastly, remember that the plants know best. When a caterpillar walks on a plant tissue, on a plant leaf, sometimes some plants can actually basically feel it, and they can send a calcium response through the plant, which will harden off the leaves or make them bitter, have some sort of plant response. And like I mentioned in the beginning, sometimes the plant response is to create a pesticide that's inside of it already. That would, if not strong enough to kill the pests, it will just ward them off and make an adjacent plant look more appetizing. And that's just that's one example of a million ways that plants fight off their own infection. So that, again, and this is probably the central focus of my channel, is just have a bit of patience. So yes, the water and all the tools are available, but still the best practice is just to wait and see. This cucumber right here has spider mite on it. I actually put it on there sort of accidentally, but I was trying to grow a spider mite population for work purposes. It has spider mite on there. If I look hard enough, I can still find them, but there's spider mite predators on there as well, and it's a happy, healthy looking plant so far in this cool spring that we've had. And I don't need to worry about it. I'm just gonna leave it. Later in the year, it, along with all the other squashes, will get powdery mildew. I have patience and tolerance for that as well, because that's just part of the natural process. As soon as the plant starts sucking the nutrients and pumping it into the fruit, because it's an annual and its only purpose is to produce fruit that will survive the winter, I guess, or at least produce enough seeds to be spread immediately. It weakens the leaf tissue. It sucks that nutrients out of those leaves. The leaves become susceptible to the powdery mildew that was already there to begin with. It's on the leaves right now. Those spores are there. It's just healthy enough plant to fight off those infections. So I'm just gonna leave these plants alone, and they are gonna do the best job that they can anyways. Again, buddy?
Can you please get that piece for me? Thank you. Now can you open it, please?
Thanks again for watching. If you want more content like this, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'm David Spencer, and thank you for watching Gardening with Bugs.